There are two kinds of exposure in the life of a clown. One is professional, lined and rehearsed. The moment the coat is tucked through the belt, the two left shoes arranged deliberately wrong. The painted smile stitched to an exact compass point on the cheek. The other kind arrives without a dressing room attendant. It is wet, it is sudden, and it tends to arrive during downpours. I knew, with the small certainties one accumulates by alternating pratfalls and observation, that the latter was not a thing to be scheduled. The seam of the tent had been teasing us for days like an old joke no one could remember. It frayed in the way that old loyalties fray, with a series of patient, invisible loosenings, until suddenly there is a single thread left and the whole thing seems optional. The morning it finally lost patience with us. The rain had taken on the particular insistence of a thing that has decided to be heard. It drummed on the canvas with the rhythm of small hands and settled into the ground like a ledger being opened. The troupe moved through the half-light as if through a well-thumbed script. Nell checked the line from above, her boots whispering like a metronome. Gus rattled tools as if punctuation could be made to hold the sentence together. August polished his brass counter with the kind of ritual affection reserved for instruments that measure livelihoods and sometimes souls. I mounted the stage as I always did, a little too early and a little too aware of the empty seats being less empty than moist. The tent held an audience like a mouth holds a secret tenuously, and with the hope that what is said inside will not drip out. The bulb over the center of the ring hummed like a single note held too long, and I told myself that a confession was in its own fashion a kind of performance. The distinction between revealing and performing is a shifty one in my trade. Sometimes a revelation is merely a bit with better lighting. We will try something different today, I said into the hum, because one should never begin an experiment without a preamble. One of our new acts, Truth. It will be inexpensive for you and perhaps a little cheaper for me. A polite gasp measured like most of August's applause tollies. Someone clutched an umbrella like a prop and then relaxed. What happens if truth does not get laughs? Etta had asked me earlier, when we sat over a kettle and she smoothed a crease in her ledger with fingers that smelled faintly of mildew and mint. Then we catalogue it, I had said in the safe light of the table lamp. We put it in the proper drawer. She had given me the look of someone who keeps drawers for feelings and who knows all too well the poverty of filing joy alongside sorrow. On stage, the beginning of my story felt like testing a dull knife. I told it in small measurements: the room where the laugh happened, the wrong placement of a joke, the man whose private sorrow became an accidental stage prop. I chose small facts because shame keeps its weather small at first. There is, in confession, the insurgent hope that specificity will become clemency. I could feel the tent stitching itself to my pulse. The day we keep repeating is usually the one that wants to be let go of by being said aloud. And I had rehearsed the telling as if it were a new juggling trick, minimal, precise, to the point where the audience would nod, do a small sympathetic laugh, and then we would move on without anyone consulting the brass counter. Then the floor betrayed me. There is a plank under the eastern side of the ring that has a habit of remembering every footstep as if it were a family member, and that day it decided to keep the memories. My foot found it, the wood tilted in a way that said, "Ah, so this is how you meant to be seen," and I went over in a manner that looked less like a pratfall and more like a sudden revision. The audience laughed, which is to say they produced the sound that keeps our kind in business and our hearts out of certain violence. It was the wrong kind of laughter for a confession. It had the shape of delight in spectacle, rather than the mercy that an honest redaction demands. The laugh was not against me so much as indifferent, a recognition of what they were used to, an automatic response to frequency. People clap at falls as survival tactics. I lay there, the canvas at my back smelling of damp sawdust and old jokes, and I felt something peel away. It was not just paint flaking. It was the last polite layer of costume that allows an actor to hold an embarrassment at safe distance from their bones. Without that distance, humiliation reads differently. It reads as nakedness. Marigold appeared as if conjured by the very concept of mirror. She stepped into the ring behind my still body and did something that was, from a distance, a performance. But from where I lay, it felt like someone opening a book and reading me aloud in mime. She mimed the falling plank with a clarity that made me wince, and then the face of the man at the center of the story, and finally the laugh that followed. Her lips made a circle that was both precise and cruel in its honesty. The crowd laughed again, because humans are often obliged to meet a censure with a reflex. But her eyes remained calm. They were the only thing on her face that did not perform. She moved closer and touched my shoulder in a manner that was more gesture than medicine. The touch said, "This is not only about the plank. This is about admission." While the audience adjusted their expectations, something else shifted in the tent, a rustle like paper turning. It was the sound of claws on ledger. The auditor's clerks had arrived with the bureaucratic punctuality of bad weather. They moved through the crowd like punctuation marks moving toward the clause they wanted to end. Their hems shed slips of paper like autumn leaves, and each scrap carried tiny numbers that made the brass counter seem like a child's abacus. I wanted, briefly and absurdly, to say, "Do you prefer me deadpan or in tourniquet?" But there are jokes one must not attempt when seated on the ground watching clerks unroll themselves like the world is a receipt. Someone in the back, where the rain lit people like wet coins, cleared their throat. The voice belonged to a woman who arranged thunderbolts for a living, the rain librarian. She moved through the crowded benches with the ease of someone who had learned to read the weather for footnotes. When she spoke, it was not a loud voice. Thunder taught her that volume is a poor substitute for punctuation. When a laugh is paired with shame, she said, and my realization of her presence was like being watched through wet glass. It becomes legible. The ledger reads it as two entries. It cannot be filed as mirth alone because the other column insists on memory. That makes it awkward for the auditor. This sentence was the smallest kind of salvation, a precis. It said that my problem was not simply lack of laughter but a miscategorization. The auditor loved categories. It ate single-line entries and left no crumbs. If the laugh could present itself as two things at once, mirth and confession, then perhaps it might not fit the auditor's breadbox of accounts. Marigold began to pantomime not merely my fall, but the moment before the fall, the hesitation of my foot, the tightening in my mouth, the attempt to say something brave. She did it in slow motion, the speed one reserves for making grief legible. The audience stopped laughing. It was a small silence, the sort that arrives when a whole town realizes they've misread punctuation in a letter that matters. From somewhere near the front, a woman snuffled, and it was not the theatrical kind of snuffle that later resolves into applause. It was a human sound, like someone wiping a smudge from a photograph. A child let go of his guardian's sleeve and pointed at Marigold. His hand closed on mine as if to anchor the sight. When someone touches you in a way that says, "I see you there and I will not let you be alone in that sight," it changes the physics of confession. I sat up, feeling the coolness of the boards under my knees. The stage lights were invested in revealing my face, but had not expected me to do the revealing myself. My voice came out as if from a kettle with a very small hole. "I laughed," I said. "I laughed at someone who did not want to be seen. I thought it clever, which is what you think when you have not yet measured the weight of what you are carrying." The joke fell in the wrong place. I was laughed at secretly later as a warning. I believed it. Someone took the matter into their hands and pressed a fine seal against the edge of my laughter. And now I make everyone else laugh and cannot break the seal. Saying it aloud did not make it theatrical. It did not turn the admission into a trick with a satisfying third movement. It turned into a thing that smelled faintly of stale lemon and regret. and it had the embarrassing property of looking a little like the life of the person who had once received the wrong kind of laughter. You could see, in people's faces, their small recognitions. A husband remembering the day a joke had turned private. A vendor recalling the sound of a laugh made in the wrong room. Recognition is contagious like yawning, only more complicated. The Rain librarian leaned forward and said, as if she were consulting a particularly stubborn file, "Auditors hate cross-entries. They are the grammatical errors of the universe. You must present it as both things, or it will be filed as nothing." That sounded like a technicality and a salvation in the same breath. It explained why the seal existed. The auditor loved clean columns. If a thing could be both joy and sorrow, it refused to be reconciled in neat sums. There were small noises of understanding. August's brass counter, which he kept like a rosary, clicked once, as if considering whether the click counted as a conversion. The clerks, meanwhile, rustled. They were not moved by the Rain librarian's theory. They had something else to do. They had names to cross off. They unfurled a small map of the tent in their hands and began to measure the distance between my confession and Marigold's mimicry. They counted the number of people who ceased laughing and tried to mark it as shifts in atmosphere, as if one could calculate empathy. It is impossible to insult a body that is offering itself as a confessional. The only recourse left to a bystander is either disdain or mercy, and mercies do not announce themselves. They arrive like small boats when the tide has been misread. The woman in the front row, Mrs. Finch, from the bakery, who had given me stale donuts once and an unexpected sense of direction, stood up. She placed a hand on the small of her back, a domestic posture that suddenly enrolled the tent in the business of kinship. "We all do things," she said, as if listing ingredients for a recipe that sometimes goes wrong. "We do them because we are hungry. We make jokes the way we need dough, without always thinking of the person inside." Her voice carried across the tent like a reassurance. A handful of people laughed again, softly, but the kind of laugh that is made of recognition rather than spectacle. It sounded like someone relacing a shoe. I felt something shift inside me that I had not expected. The seal that had been set against my own amusement, placed there by argument and weather and a friend's small vindictiveness, began to feel less like a stone and more like a removed bandage. It did not dissolvingly snap. It loosened under the tiny tidal force of witness. When witness is compassionate, it is a kind of slow thaw. Marigold's mime moved into an enactment of forgiveness. She tilted her head, made the motion of offering a small paper heart, and then folding it back into an open palm. The audience let out a collective exhale. Somewhere a clerk counted an exhale. Somewhere else a child began to hum a nonsense tune that the Rain adopted. The risk we had taken turning a private apology into a public performance had failed at being elegant. It had become instead a messy, breathing thing. The auditor's clerks took note and made their notations, but not all notes are decisive. Sometimes they are the prelude to something else, a deliberation that takes into account the local humidity of feeling. Afterward, in the small, obligatory clearing of the tent, when half the audience had gone back into the rain and the other half lingered to hand back umbrellas as if in apology, I found the Rain librarian by the flapping side of the ring. "You made a mistake in order to make a point," she said, her voice like pages turning. "It is an old tactic. But the mistake was not the collapse. The mistake was believing the laughter you could not retrieve was yours alone. I thought if I made it public," I said, and my voice tasted of iron, "then maybe I would be allowed to keep a part of it. Or at least borrow it back." She considered me, eyes like wet coins reflect the lamplight. "Borrowing is still a transaction. You must give something. The ledger takes only what is given freely. If you offer your shame in barter for laughter, you will have both." The auditor cannot reconcile that without admitting it has no monopoly on closure. There is a certain cruelty in practical metaphors. They make ethics sound like economics, and yet she was right. My attempt to force laughter into being was partly commerce and partly theft. I had hoped to withdraw from a bank that will not recognize me as an account holder. What the tense small congregation had offered instead was a different currency acknowledgement. Marigold, who had been watching with the attention of a person invested in small theatrical truths, took off her glove and handed it to me. It was white and smelled faintly of chalk. "Keep it," she said without speaking. "You will need it when the mock trial begins. People believe in papers. They believe less in hands. Use both." And then, because every theatrical moment is followed by stagecraft, we did what performers do. We packed, we mended, we put bandages on the things that were useful. Gus took apart a splintered plank and promised it less treachery in the future. Nell walked the tightrope even then, because people of her sort balance uncertainty like a vocation. I walked out into the rain that had been the reason we were here in the first place. It was not the balm of a deus ex machina. It was the weather that had listened. A child Theo, who had laughed without reservation in an earlier town, ran up and handed me a small paper boat. "For when you go overboard again," he said simply. I put the boat in my pocket, next to the pocket watch that tells past jokes. It ticked, and for the first time in a long while it did not sound mocking. It sounded like a watch that had stopped arguing with memory. The auditor's clerks had not gone. They lingered at the margins like storm drains, and I could see their pens moving less with the certainty of fate, and more with the curiosity of functionaries who suspect that the manual may have an appendix. The Rain librarian bowed once, a note in a score that had wider movements to come. We had failed and succeeded in the same breath. We had been stripped to the truth in a way that hurt and healed. It was not a tidy redemption. It was a rearrangement. The ledger had to be read differently now, because people had begun writing marginalia in their margins. As I made ready to sleep on a cot in the performer's wagon, my mind kept returning to the shape of Marigold's pantomime, the tiny gestures that made my shame legible. That quiet mirroring had done more than illustrate my embarrassment. It had given it a grammar. If laughter could be read differently on a ledger, then perhaps the mock trial we planned would not be merely provocation. It might be a method. Outside, the rain softened. The tent held for now. Inside, something unstitched and removed itself. My chest still felt hollow where laughter should have been. But hollow can be a space that accepts things. I put my hand inside and felt the paper boat, felt the glove, and felt the faint heat of people not recoiling. In the morning we would decide to turn jest into evidence. We would turn our spectacle into procedure. We would make an argument that was part circus and part courtroom, because the world prefers categories and we were determined to give it an inconvenient combination. The clerks would count. The auditor would possibly frown. But if the ledger expected neat entries, it had yet to encounter an entry that arrived as both confession and chorus. I slept with Marigold's glove on the table beside me and thought of the way a mime turns air into architecture. If we could convince the world that a laugh could be both apology and exaltation, then perhaps the tent would not unravel until the last town had consented to remember how to weather together. And when I woke, with the smell of wet wood in my nostrils and the knowledge that the mock trial was not far off, I found myself unable to decide whether the thing I felt most was dread or a kind of mercantile hope. It is a peculiar middle place to occupy, to be frightfully honest and yet scheming. But if anything in this life has taught me how to navigate contradiction, it is the act of holding two incompatible gestures in one hand, one glove white and one glove used, and deciding which to present to the world. The run of the show had changed its course. Whether the auditor would accept the adjustment, or whether the clerks would mark it down as a deviation to be corrected, was a matter for the next performance. We would show up. We would build an argument out of pratfalls and petitions. We would invite the townspeople to write marginalia into the ledger of the world. And if that sounded like a ridiculous plan, remember, most of the best plans begin as ridiculous things that refuse to be ignored. I dressed, smoothed a line in my jacket that had never quite been straight since childhood, and stepped out into a rain that no longer felt like accusation. It felt like weather that had been waiting for someone to ask it a question. Tomorrow, I said to no one in particular, we will test whether vulnerability can be evidence. The tent answered by flapping once like an exclamation point. We took a circus to court because that was in the end what our expertise allowed. We are, all of us, practiced theater makers. If you must litigate with a faceless metaphysical accountant, it is useful to have tap routines and pie gags in your legal repertoire. Practicality aside, there was a more tender reason. The auditor pays attention to paperwork and spectacle. It both loathed and respected a thing that declared itself official. If we wanted to be noticed as wronged rather than as a nuisance, we needed a former clerks might understand. We gave them a form they would not expect, a trial that was also a performance, and a confession that was also a play. By mid-morning the tent had been converted into an absurd courthouse. Signs were painted on old banners, Court of Common Joy, in letters that tried desperately to be both solemn and hand-lettered. Nell sewed a gavel out of a rubber chicken and a piece of salvaged wood because it seemed important to have something that could both enforce and satirize justice. August polished his brass counter until it reflected the whole tent upside down. He put it on a small pedestal as if it were both an exhibit and a witness. Gus set up his machine at the back, wires spilling like curious roots. Marigold took a place where her silence would be visible, and Etta arranged her stacks of notebooks and folded lists on a small oak table like exhibits. "We need to be exact," Etta said, her spectacles fogging as she read the docket aloud. "Precise accusation, precise confession. The auditor respects neither passion nor sloppiness. It only respects ledgers. Therefore we will be ledgers that sing. Make the facts beautiful. Make the shame useful. Make the ritual undeniable." Etta delivered this as if she were ticking off errands. She had the old librarian's cadence, folding a sentence the way other people fold letters, and it made the impulse feel like paperwork and like prayer simultaneously. I admired her because clerks like her had once organized my life into neat spaces where nothing leaked. They were my salvation and my imprisonment in turn. "We will begin with the mock trial," August said, standing behind the pedestal and looking like a man contemplating whether he ought to call for recess. "We will call witnesses. We will petition. We will demand a hearing. We will be terribly serious and terribly ridiculous in equal measure. That is how one gets a bureaucrat's attention. It is also how one keeps the crowd engaged." He spoke as if the two aims were distinct, but he knew better. He had always known that performance and petition were different names for the same necessary deception. Still, I sensed his hand tremble when he lifted his brass counter, and that tremble was more honest than any of us wished to admit. The audience gathered with umbrellas tucked under their arms like damp flags. They came because a fair was promised, and because secrets have a way of finding the same places they have once warmed. The townsfolk placed themselves cautiously on benches and crates, their faces damp and drawn but receptive. Some of them Mrs. Finch included, had been the reason we pitched here at all. She had supplied rolls and a story at dawn. The kind that fits like the last missing patch on a quilt. Others were merchants, rain librarians, board council clerks on odd leave. These last were the most interesting because their presence altered the balance of what we could get away with. Actual clerks in actual suits had been seen at the edge of town in the last week, and rumor has teeth where facts have feathers. Marigold began the proceedings not with a spoken invocation, but with an elaborate pantomime. She mimed a judge, slow and exaggerated, bringing forth invisible evidence. She made a show of placing a paper in an invisible file, then of being surprised when the paper transformed into a bird and flew away. The tent laughed the polite laugh of those who think something is about to be serious but are not certain which part. Nobody minded. The tent, at least, was a place where the uncertain had room to become sure. Then it was my turn. I had prepared an opening statement the way one prepares to fall, rehearsed the motions, removed objects that might catch, and told myself that gravity, in the sense I was about to enact, is as much moral as physical. Gus had insisted that the witness stand be less like a stool and more like a stage. He had bolted a small lamp to it so I could see the little script it folded into my palm. The lamp threw my paper's shadow onto my glove, and in that shadow the letters of my confession looked like tiny marching men. Merindral August intoned, and the brass clinked as if applause had been invited to take a civic turn. You will repeat for the record what happened at the music room the winter the rain came late. I could have lied. I had lied many times before in brand new costumes, in reputations polished and scheduled. But the very point of a real trial is that it turns theatricality into testimony. Once ritual becomes truth, it binds. I breathed. The pocket watch in my vest warmed under my hand. It told not the hour but 3 jokes. It told the previous week, which was its way of being consoling. I read the sentence aloud, 'cause I had promised to. I laughed, I said. The tent made the smallest sound, a wet intake like a person surprised by cold water. I laughed at a private sorrow. It was mean and thoughtless in equal measure. I was not aware then that my laugh would be forged into a becoming and a bargain that would follow me like a shadow. The words sat in the air and tasted like old pennies. The image I described was one that had haunted me, a night when a man, who had come to the music room to weep quietly in the dark between rehearsals, had been the butt of a joke I told to impress a patron. My laugh had been an instinct, sharp, reflexive, and wrong. It was also, as Etta had surmised, the seed around which the auditor had found purchase. Where sorrow had been private, my laughter made it public, and where it became public, someone with less heart and more policy had taken a note. I expected to defend myself. I expected to explain context, to make the laugh sound like a mistake and not a malice. Instead, in the most inconvenient way, I felt relief. Dishonesty is a warm coat, but confession is a lighter garment you can breathe through. The crowd shifted. People embroidered me with their own small memories, someone remembering being laughed at for the wrong reasons, someone else recalling the warmth of a borrowed joke. Faces rearranged themselves into sympathy and recognition. I read the passage one more time and then another, as if repetition could make the sin less sharp. Etta stood then and laid her ledger upon the oak table like a ceremonial Bible. It was neither small nor tidy. Her notebooks had been stitched with names and weather patterns, and more importantly, the tiny failures of people who had come to her for quiet comfort and been kept at the doorstep because there were forms to fill out, because a clerk asked for procedure, because a city council had once signed a pact with someone who loved tidy sums. This, she said, fingers trembling as she opened the book, is not just a list of storms. It is a list of things left unspoken, of letters not sent, of concerts that were cancelled for the sake of balance sheets. We have been taught to fold sorrow into papers so it can be filed away. The auditor has taught towns to measure festivity as a line item and to accept the subtraction of silliness as fiscal prudence. It is a kind of theft. Her voice did something delightful and terrible. It slid across the space between accusation and impulse and stuck. We had always known Etta to be cautious. The ledger was a revelation precisely because she had always been the person to hide the loose thread. I watched August's face while she spoke. He was a man trained to balance books who had not yet considered the ethics of what was being balanced. There was a fleck of red at the corner of his eye like a small cartographic error. Then Nell walked the line. She mounted the high wire not because we asked, but because she always did things halfway her way of refusing easy pity. The tent hushed in the manner of an audience about to witness an execution. and Nell moved across the thin grey line with a smoothness that disarmed fear. At the center she paused and dropped, not into failure, but into a repertoire of trust. She let herself fall and caught the banner we had attached for the purpose. The catch was theatrical and real in equal measure. When she landed, it was as if someone had taken a seam and stitched the tent back up with one visible, muscular stitch. The effect was immediate. The audience gasped and then applauded, not the counted clink of a brass counter, but an unmeasured rush that came from people who had been holding their breath for weeks. The sound went around the tent and back, and it did something to the ledger. If applause were a type of currency, this was a kind that could not be hoarded. It was noise that wanted to be shared. Gus, from the back, fed his machine through the current of the sound. He had taken his contraption previously, a monstrous thing that counted and commodified mirth, and refashioned it overnight. He told me beforehand, grinning like a man who'd stolen a small ethical compromise from the world, if you can't stop a thing, at least change what it is counting. What the device recorded now were not decibel levels but sentences. Gus had attached little tin funnels and a spool of paper, and as the audience breathed and cried and clapped, the contraption transcribed. It hummed like a bassoon and printed out a ribbon that read not numbers but fragments. She forgave him once for a thing she could not name. He always brings his lunch for two in case someone sits next to him. My mother used to whistle when the rain started, and now I whistle for her. It made the crowd into a list of people, not statistics. The clerks, the paper storm that moved like a flock just beyond the circle of lanterns, hissed and shuffled through their own rustling forms. They were built to digest ledgers, to fold numbers into neat conclusions. The spool of Gus' machine flopped on the table like an obstinate fish, and they did not know what to do with it. It was data they could not pass because it was narrative. At a certain point during my reading, when the sentences had been said, and the ledger had been opened, and Nell had sewn the tent with her body, I felt a small, ridiculous thing occur. The seed of my laugh, long thought to be stolen or cursed, did not suddenly revert to me in the way of fairy tales. There was no single guffaw that leaped back into my throat like a rescued bird. Instead, the tent did something stranger. It became a place where confession and audience met, and where the result was neither wholly private nor wholly public, but something between. When a man in the front row, a baker with flour still on his sleeve, began to tell, in a voice that raked its way out of him, about the time he'd laughed at his wife's grief because he didn't know how to hold it, I felt the laugh I had lost fold into that. It was as if laughter were a potion mixed in public. No one person owned the recipe, and everyone warmed themselves from the pot. We had turned the mockery of the mock trial into a jurisdiction the auditor could not wholly ignore. August, who had intended to treat applause as currency, adjusted his approach halfway through and counted, not with his brass counter, but with his hands, measuring the moments when the audience stepped forward to share. "We count differently now," he said to no one in particular, and the brass counter, left on its pedestal, looked embarrassed and obsolete. At one point the tent's flap rustled and a paper clerk pushed its way to the fringe, a grey shape smelling faintly of damp ink. It made a notation mechanistic and cold. We had expected them to be obstinate, to insist that the ledger remained dominant. What we had perhaps not expected was the visible confusion a clerk displayed when confronted with people telling stories rather than producing receipts. One made an effort to staple a sentence. The staple did not hold. Marigold, with all the unspoken eloquence of pantomime, stood up midway and acted out the precise minute I had read about. She pulled the empathy from my chest and made a loop around it, as though she were showing how easy it is to knot a thing into a joke. She mimed the patron overly bright, one hand always on a ledger with a pen that had been carved from a judge's gavel, and then she mimed the music room's dark corner and the man's small, private grief. When she mimed the laugh, it was not funny. It was a shape the audience recognized as wrong and then forgivable. By the time I had finished the recitation of the original incident, a curious phenomenon had developed. People in the audience were stepping forward with tiny confessions. They were not all of them apologies. Some gave stories of petty cruelties, others of small kindnesses misapplied. The tent turned into a confessional booth that also served tea. Etta accepted each as a ledger entry, and then, in the movement that defined her, she turned the ledger into a map for repair. "We note this down," she said, writing, "and we will fold it in when we mend. We will stitch your stories into our canvases as a way of remembering not to let them be eaten by ledgers." The auditor watched. I cannot describe its face because it had none, but it behaved as if something in its arithmetic had gone rotten. Clerks fluttered and tried to index the spool of sentences Gus produced. They took snippets, tried to fit them into boxes, and a smug air of certainty that had once accompanied the creation of municipal ordinances now looked as thin as a torn program. The auditor's ledger tooled in cloud-stitched binding grew restless whenever another human narrative was presented. It disliked randomness. It preferred sums. At the crucial moment, when I felt the balance tip between juridical farce and something like justice, August did something no rational ringmaster would have done. He took his brass counter, the instrument he had always used to measure applause, and handed it to the baker in the front row. "Count us differently," he said. "Not for price, not for value. Count for the moment. Count for the breaths between one person's telling and another's answer. Count the times the tent stitches with hands. Count the shared silence. If you must count, count for repair." The baker blinked, then grinned, and with two large fingers he clicked the brass and put it down gently on his knee, as if an heirloom could be redeemed by the gentleness of a market hand. The sound of the counter was irrelevant. What mattered was the gesture, an economist made public as a craftsman. We did not defeat the auditor in a single act. That was not a plausible story, and we do not keep implausible stories in our tent. What we did, however, was construct a new accounting. Workable, perhaps temporary, but real, a ledger of stories stitched with care. Gus ribbon rolled and unrolled. Etta put her name on the first page and then, as a move of theatrical generosity, handed the book to a clerk who had the temerity to step inside the circle. The clerk took the book like a man offered a strange animal. He read, confused at first, and then something like comprehension softened the angle of his shoulders. I did not regain my laugh in the neat, cinematic way I had hoped for when I first vowed to do this. I did not fall into a roaring, sovereign guffaw that purified my throat. Instead, what returned was smaller and more porous, the ability to let other people's laughter land on me without feeling it steal something. When a child in the back, Theo, whose name I had learned and whom I had promised to watch over, snorted, and then giggled at a ridiculous image I presented. The sound did not deny me anything. It folded me into the communal warm bath. It allowed me to give my laugh away and have pieces of it come back not as restitution, but as relatives. By the time the tent folded up that evening, Gus had wound the spool into a coil of paper that looked like a rope of small lives. Nell had her ribbon knotted into the top of the ledger, as if to declare that risk had been married to penance. August walked around with his counter silent in his pocket, looking at people as if he had remembered how to look at them without thinking of profit margins. Marigold kept pantomiming the small, intimate things we still needed to do for one another, bringing soup, mending hems, telling the truth when it was required, and telling a lie that eases someone's load when necessary. Outside the tent the rain had stopped, as if the sky wished to allow us this reprieve. The paper clerks drifted away like a flock slowly deciding a migration was no longer needed. Some would return, of course they are persistent, and legal systems are long-lived, but the ledger we had created had the taste of a living thing, and living things make orange stains on the tidy habits of clerks. I walked a little way to the edge of town, where the street lamps sputter, and the puddles remember faces. My pocket watch, always a bad timepiece and a good companion, clicked softly. It did not tell me the joke of the hour, as was its wont, but instead hummed a phrase that felt suspiciously like a promised return. "You did not get it all back," Etta said beside me. She had a damp fold of paper in her hand and her spectacles were beaded with light. "But you put something out into the world that makes it harder for it to be taken. That counts." She said the last word like someone finally willing to say a word they had only ever written. "We counted for repair tonight," I said. We measured the breathing between a confession and a forgiveness. Etta smiled in the way people do when they have finished a ledger and found a surprise at the bottom, a pressed forget-me-not or a train ticket long expired. "Tomorrow we will have to teach towns how to raid their own ledgers. That may be the long work, but tonight, perhaps the auditor learned a new entry. Consider the cost of taking." Something in the dark laughed then, and at first I thought it was merely the tent settling. But then I heard a child's small peal break through the hush, an honest, startled laugh that landed in the puddle water and made it ripple. Theo. I knew him by his shoelaces, one tied in perfect loops and the other always loose for reasons I could not know. I turned as the sound traveled like an opened seam in the world. The laugh was simple and not mine in any sense that mattered, and yet its resonance in the tent felt like a promise. If the auditor was a force that cataloged and took, then perhaps the smallest counter-strategy was not a treaty but repetition, the practice of telling small truths aloud, of publicly admitting our cruelties and missteps, and of insisting on a space where stories could be returned to people rather than to books. We had not won, we had started a repair. The tent's canvas still bore small gaps sewn with hope and improvisation. The pockets of our lives were not yet full. But as I watched Theo's laugh ripple and be echoed by a woman 2 rows back who clapped and wept at once, I felt the shape of something like laughter take room inside me. It was not the old, clean laugh I had once traded away. It was ragged and wet and communal and, if one were being metaphoric, stitched in by many hands. I turned back into the light of the tent, where characters had gathered like a choir who didn't know the hymn, but felt the need to hum. We were, each of us, both spectacle and confessor now. The next act, if acts had to be counted, would be the one where we learned to do this not as a single dramatic burst, but as an ugly, daily practice. To ask for rain and to agree together how we might return it. The hook, if one insists on such tidy devices, was simple enough. In the crowd sat a child who laughed as though he owned the world. He had been listening during my confession. He had not been frightened away by my shame. In fact, the laugh made room for the next stage of the problem, the one that would ask me to risk being ridiculous again, but this time with a different currency. For the first time in a long while, I felt like practicing that risk might be less about reclaiming a loss and more about teaching others how to keep theirs. The tent folded that night, not into defeat, but into a promise. We had turned theater into law and law into theater, and somewhere between the two, the auditor had discovered something it was not used to, a crowd that would not let its laughter be filed away. I closed the small pocket watch and slid it back into my vest. It whispered a joke I had told once to a sleeping child. I did not laugh out loud. Instead, I let the sound of other people laughing fill me like a shirt hung to dry in a storm of small mercies. The trial had ended, but the work had begun. The next day, if the towns would attend, we would measure the ways we might stitch the world back together, one awkward, generous confession at a time.